Former Congressman Tom Lantos, one of the 5 Holocaust survivors featured in The Last Days, was personally involved with creating and perpetuating another series of atrocity lies, which led the U.S. down the road to endless wars in the Middle East on behalf of Israel. Tom Lantos' Congressional Human Rights Caucus held a hearing after the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq. At the time, the American people were hesitant about getting involved with another Vietnam. Lantos' Human Rights Caucus presented witnesses who spoke about alleged atrocities committed in Kuwait by Iraqi soldiers. It was revealed months after this hearing successfully pushed the U.S. into the first Gulf War that this hearing was a scripted hoax, created with the help of the public relations firm who shared an office building with Lantos' organization.
Operation Desert Shield, economic sanctions, and other aspects of the world's reaction to Saddam Hussein's horrendous breach of international boundaries have been examined from almost every possible perspective. But very little has been reported about what is actually happening inside Kuwait. I'd like to call now upon my co-chairman, Congressman Tom Lantos of California.
What we have seen since the 2nd of August boggles the mind. Vast numbers of men, women, and children, yes, children, were killed, executed by the Iraqi regime. Premature infants in incubators were sentenced to die by having the incubators removed and the children allowed to perish. The nightmarish pictures on the cover of Newsweek of piles of bodies of Kurdish women and children killed by Saddam Hussein's poison gas attack on the Iraqi village of Halabja, populated by Kurdish citizens, is one of the most horrendous pictures to be presented to this world since the pictures of the Holocaust 45 years ago. He is now determined, with his capability of chemical, biological, and soon nuclear weaponry, to bring untold horror to this region. It is our purpose to highlight during the course of this morning, with the assistance of qualified witnesses, Saddam Hussein's human rights record in Kuwait.
This hearing will set the stage for how we announce to the world what is going on in Kuwait and the devastation which I believe is occurring to this country. In recent weeks, some people have questioned why we as the American people got involved in Kuwait. Some have suggested it was merely for our own economic interest to protect our strategic oil supplies. What we do here today may set the stage, as I indicated earlier, for the next 10 years.
We will proceed with our first witness, the Ambassador of Kuwait, His Excellency Sheikh Saud Nasir al-Sabah.
As you have so eloquently put it, Congressman Lantos, and described the basic violations of human rights with regard to the hospitals in Kuwait, the schools in Kuwait, and the looting of private homes that's taking place, and the mass destruction of the infrastructure which we so proudly built in the country over the last 30 years. Today you're going to hear not hearsay evidence. You're going to hear eyewitnesses who have lived through these atrocities by the Iraqi people.
Questions for the Ambassador?
I have a couple of questions.
Tom Lantos.
We have been advised that there has been rape on an indiscriminate and massive scale. There has been the most brutal torture of both men, women, and children, with prolonged beatings on the most sensitive parts of the human body, the extraction of fingernails and toenails, electric shock. Are these the kinds of reports you are getting?
Yes, sir, they are the kind of reports that I'm getting, all the above.
I can only ask how these animals can commit such barbaric and inhuman acts and then deny that these acts ever took place. When President Bush likened Saddam Hussein to Adolf Hitler, it rang true to me. Although Saddam Hussein may not yet have carried out an organized genocide against the people of Kuwait, he certainly is committing acts against humanity of unimaginable brutality.
All this is clearly reminiscent of actions taken by Hitler in the 1930s and 40s.
Our final witness is also using an assumed name, and again we ask our friends in the media to respect the need for her to protect her family. And we finally call on Naira to testify.
The second week after an invasion, I volunteered at the Al-Adan hospital with 12 other women who wanted to help as well. I was the youngest volunteer. The other women were from 20 to 30 years old. While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators, and left the children to die on the cold floor. It was horrifying. I saw and talked to a friend of mine after his torture and released by the Iraqis. He is 22, but he looked as though he could have been an old man. The Iraqis dunked his head into a swimming pool until he almost drowned. They pulled out his fingernails and applied electric shock to sensitive private parts of his body. He was lucky to survive. I'm glad I'm 15, old enough to remember Kuwait before Saddam Hussein destroyed it, and young enough to rebuild it. Thank you.
You have performed a service of incalculable value. And one can only hope and pray that every American, and indeed every citizen of every civilized country, will hear your story. There are rare moments in history when we are confronted with human depravity of incredible proportions. We had the killing fields in Cambodia. We had the Holocaust with millions innocent killed. And now we have the rape of the people of Kuwait. You have shaken up all of us, even those who have seen horror firsthand, like myself. It was 51 years ago that Adolf Hitler unleashed unspeakable horrors on mankind. And the initial reaction of vast numbers was one of disbelief or lack of interest. Saddam Hussein has now unleashed on the people of Kuwait unspeakable horrors. He is ready to unleash unspeakable horrors to other nations in the area. And it is the responsibility of all of us to awaken an indifferent and disinterested world community to what this new Hitler means.
Tonight, it was the most shocking atrocity story about Iraq's invasion of Kuwait.
They took the babies out of the incubators. Took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor.
But was it true?
2 weeks after the liberation, it became apparent that the story was a complete hoax.
Lyndon McIntyre exposes the big lie of the Gulf crisis and the massive public relations campaign that whipped up war fever in the United States.
Citizens for a Free Kuwait wanted to get public opinion behind a full-scale commitment to liberate their country. So they paid $10.7 million to America's biggest public relations company, Hill and Knowlton, Inc. But early on, their daily polling showed most ordinary Americans didn't care about Kuwait. At the time Congressman Porter and Lantos chaired the hearing on Kuwait, they also headed a private group, the Congressional Human Rights Foundation. MacArthur discovered a disturbing link between the Human Rights Foundation and the PR firm that was selling the war.
The Congressional Human Rights Foundation literally operates out of Hill and Knowlton's offices on the second floor of an office complex called Washington Harbor in Georgetown. Hill and Knowlton provides a $3,000 in-kind charitable contribution to the Congressional Human Rights Foundation in the form of a rent reduction for the office space.
The link between Hill and Knowlton and the Human Rights Foundation doesn't end there. Frank Mankiewicz, vice chairman of Hill and Knowlton, became a director of the Human Rights Foundation. And there are other interconnections.
Citizens for a Free Kuwait donated $50,000 to the Congressional Human Rights Foundation after Iraq invaded Kuwait.
Daylight brings only the digging of yet more graves as bodies...
Soon there were reports of mass burials of premature babies in Kuwait, dumped from incubators which were then trucked to Baghdad.
The Iraqis tore the respirators from their incubators.
We had to bury many of people.
And the story didn't just have an impact in the U.S. The United Nations convened a rare public forum.
The hardest thing was burying the babies. I myself buried 14 newborn babies that had been taken from their incubators by the soldiers.
Will those
in a vote 2 days later, the UN approved the use of force against Iraq. Within days of the UN session, a report on Kuwait by Amnesty International quoted Naira's testimony to the U.S. congressman, and they put a number on the infant deaths, 312. Meanwhile, the U.S. Congress was preparing to authorize military force.
Just that now is the time to check the aggression of this ruthless dictator whose troops have bayoneted pregnant women and have ripped babies from their incubators in Kuwait.
The House easily approved a war resolution. Then it was up to the Senate.
To authorize the use of United States Armed Forces pursuant to United
In the debate, the incubator story came up 7 times.
Mr. Dole, aye. Mr. Domenici, aye.
In the end, the war resolution only passed by 5 votes. These are some of the controversial incubators. When the Iraqi occupiers heard the story that they'd stolen them and killed babies in the process, they invited journalists into Kuwait hospitals to see for themselves. But the story persisted until independent investigators arrived on the scene.
We were able to go around the hospitals to count the incubators and find that, possibly with 1 or 2 that had been misplaced, that none were missing. So none of the incubators were moved in the first place. Moreover, it seemed quite clear that there weren't any deaths which had been deliberately the cause of the Iraqis having gone in and stolen equipment.
Then the picture started changing. The doctor who gave Amnesty the information that 312 babies died revised the number down to 72. It finally settled at 30, of which 19 died before the Iraqis arrived.
The story evaporated.
The video news release, the high-tech PR blurb. Hill and Knowlton generated an audio-video feast of images for the media. And one of the most compelling was Naira.
I could not help but think of my nephew, who, if born premature, might have died that day as well.
She seemed to be alone before the Congressional Human Rights Caucus identified only as a Kuwaiti escapee. But we've discovered she wasn't alone at all. And she wasn't just a simple Kuwaiti escapee. In fact, just a few seats away was her father, Kuwait's ambassador to the United States and Canada. Naira quickly slipped out of the caucus hearing, back into the protective folds of her family, the extended royal family of Kuwait, headed by the Emir Jabir al-Sabah. How many people knew that she was the ambassador's daughter?
I didn't. I don't know who knew. I did not know she was the ambassador's daughter.
When did you find out she was the ambassador's daughter?
This is the first allegation I've had that she was the ambassador's daughter.
Does it affect her credibility in your mind?
I think it certainly should have been known at the time of the hearing. It would have had bearing on what she might have said, yes. I think people, members of Congress certainly, and members of the public were entitled to know the source of her testimony, therefore who she was.
If it became known that it was somebody who was closely associated with obviously putting across a Kuwaiti government position at a particular time when public opinion was very sensitively balanced in the United States, at least, about whether or not one should be going to war, it was an evenly balanced issue, then it could well have tipped the balance one way that this was an entire show that was being arranged.
The Canadian Broadcasting Company did a decent job in their expose on the incubator atrocity hoax. However, they didn't dare point out that while the non-Jewish Congressman John Porter was deliberately kept in the dark regarding Naira's identity, the Jew Tom Lantos knew all along that the Kuwaiti girl who spoke perfect English was in fact the ambassador's daughter. After the war, the New York Times ran articles condemning Lantos for conspiring with a public relations firm to knowingly produce false testimony which pushed the U.S. towards war. Leave it to an expert, a Holocaust promoter, to fabricate wartime atrocity lies on behalf of Israel.
The Congressional Human Rights Caucus, if it has done nothing in the last 8 years but bring this one hearing to the attention of the American people, it has served its purpose. I want to thank all of you. This hearing is concluded.
That concludes this hearing of the Congressional Human Rights Caucus.